Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And I have this Blu-ray here on the table, which is part of this set of films, Friday the 13th, that came in this really exciting and splendid set from Scream Factory a few weeks back, and I had the great honor of being able to obtain and to purchase a copy, and it gave me the opportunity to consider and revisit the films in this now long and quite iconic series of horror films, which are the Friday the 13th films. And we have this film from 1980, which is Friday the 13th. I will probably be speaking, not probably, I will definitely be speaking in very detailed spoiler language. So if you haven't seen the film Friday the 13th, then please turn off this video and you can always come back if you're interested, and if not, that's okay, because I know these films aren't for everyone, because they are this violent American slasher film that does go for the gore for a lot of the time, although there are moments, I would suggest, in this film where it surprisingly holds back. And so that's one of the interesting aspects of the film, I think, Friday the 13th. But in any event, this is going to be a spoiler-y discussion of the film, or comments on the film from my point of view. I watched this film for the first time when I was quite young, and I remember the first film actually that I saw in this series of films, Friday the 13th, was in fact Friday the 13th Part 3. So that was the first one I saw on VHS tape as a rental. And I remember at that time, the film Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, had not yet been released. So the most recent film in the series was, at the time, if I recall, Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. And so it was still quite, I guess now if you think about it, relatively speaking, in its nascent stages, because as we know, it went on in terms of a kind of longevity. But the film that I first saw was Friday the 13th Part 3, and on VHS, and I was thrilled by it, I was scared by it, I was horrified, and I was fascinated all at once, and it became part of the horror film journey that I think I and many people in my same 80s VHS rental generation experienced. And from there, I tried to watch all the films that I could, as I say, that were existing at the time on VHS. So that meant A New Beginning, that meant Final Chapter, and also Part 2, and usually it was in this out-of-order fashion. So in that mix, if you will, it's interesting because my relationship, if you will, with the first film, Friday the 13th, came relatively late in that context. In other words, it was not the first film in the franchise that I saw, but I was able to see it still when I was fairly young, and I saw it on TV late at night, and I was able to record it too. So upon seeing it late night broadcast on TV, then I was able to watch it over and over again. And it was good too, because I would say that from my recollection, the violent scenes were more or less intact as far as I think the R-rated version of the film goes. So it was pretty much an intact film when it comes to its broadcast on this TV station late at night one evening, many years back. So it was that experience that I grew to discover Friday the 13th, the first one, and it's been a fascinating journey ever since. So with that, I would always have Friday the 13th films in the sort of ether, if you will, or in the consciousness of the film journey. And the other films came as well, so Part 6, Part 7, Part 8, and then everything else, of course. Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, and then Freddy vs. Jason, and then the new Friday the 13th, etc. And then there were some other iterations, of course, along the way. But for me, it would always be, because of the timing of my discovery of the films, because of that timing, it would always be for me the first 5 films. I suppose the 4 films and the 5th film, let me put it that way, being the core set of films for me. And included in which, in that discovery, albeit somewhat later within that realm of discovery, was Friday the 13th from 1980. And what do I recall from this in my journey with this and growing up? I think it would be that I was and now continue to be so surprised at how much of a thriller film it feels like, while also being a precursor, if you will, of the out-and-out slasher, the slasherific type of gore fest that we would see in later films of the franchise, of the series. But this feels very much like it's a violent film with some pretty wild and inventive scenes, courtesy of Tom Savini and company. But it's also a film that feels at times very restrained. It pulls back at just the right time. It shows us stuff, but it also decides not to show us stuff. And it maintains this really eerie use of the POV, the point of view perspective use of camera. And sometimes they're kind of tricky ways. Sometimes the camera will seem like a POV shot and it won't. Like, for instance, there's one scene where Bill is out in one of the cabins alone and the camera seems to follow him. And then it's like the killer is about to attack him, but then he turns around and we realize that it's just the camera. It's not the POV of the actual killer. And so that's an interesting play on the POV use of this of the camera in this film. But other times it is a bona fide POV of the killer. And so we get this weird, almost off-balance, off-putting, quirky way that we have characters talking straight to the camera. For instance, the hitchhiker, Annie, when she's picked up by, when we realize later is the killer, and she's talking about her dreams, Annie's talking about, she has dreams of working with children, and you really have to work hard for your dreams. That's one thing about these films. Don't ever talk about your dreams, because if you do, that's like the kiss of death, But, and then she's talking to the camera, and we realize that she's talking to what we understand is the killer. And she meets a grisly end as a result of these unfortunate set of circumstances that befalls her. And this POV is also used to very interesting effect, for instance, with the character of Steve Christie. There's a moment where Steve Christie is walking at night alone in the woods, and then he sees a shining light by the sign, Camp Crystal Lake. He's, "Oh, hi, how are you? Oh, I know you. Oh, I know." And he walks towards the camera. So that wonderful use of POV, and then suggestive of this sudden burst of violence. We assume it's some kind of weapon that is used against him in order to effect his demise. And so. And we see him later hanging in a very strategically placed position, just at the right point where Alice runs, and his body falls hanging from one of the roofs there. So the point is that the POV use, I think, is really effective, and it has this almost eerie suspense mystery quality to it as well as it being a horror slasher film. That's another thing too about this film that, of course, is very striking and has been mentioned it's been mentioned time and time again with great energy and great enthusiasm and emphasis, which I think is very valid, very, very valid, which is the fact that this is not a Jason movie, in the sense that Jason is not the killer, is in fact Mrs. Voorhees. And we get into what ends up being a really almost super complicated way that this history of Mrs. Voorhees and her son is played out, especially in the relationship between part 1 and part 2, as you know. But at least in the context of the first film, we have the mother who is avenging her little boy's death because we understand that the backstory is that in 1958, which opens the film, we get these two camp counselors, Barry and Claudette, in wonderfully yellow shirts, and they go off and they have a little bit of a try to have a fun time together. And there's one bit of dialogue that I always found fascinating was, I think Barry's legs are seen to be basically suggesting that he's lying on top of Claudette. And what does he say? He's heard saying something like, "It's not made of stone," I think. But and I always thought, what does that mean? What does that mean? But I think one can get a sense of what that means. But in any event, this is also taken, I think, from the POV, the point of view perspective of who we understand later to be Mrs. Voorhees. And this is in 1958, and this is the great way to introduce the film, the killing of these two teenagers. First, Barry, with this sudden burst of violence, and then this close-up of Claudette's face as she's caught in mid-scream, frozen, and then fade to white, and then leads to that iconic way that the titles appear, especially in these early films, the Friday, and then boom, glass crashes and ba-ba, and then goes there's oh, it's great stuff. It's just so aggressive and just in your face, and it's just not, it doesn't just announce it, it just breaks all the glass, so that's Friday the 13th in a nutshell. But so going back to the history of the mythology of this, right, according at least to at this point in the film series, this first film, right, Jason drowned in 1957. And then we get what we seem to be, we understand later to be perhaps the mother acting out her revenge, starting in 1958 for what she perceives to be the fault of the camp counselors in not paying attention, because according to Mrs. Voorhees, Jason, he wasn't a very good swimmer, right? So that is the concept of the mythology, and that leads to this whole notion, right, of camp blood, and how people try to open it up over the course of the years, but there are always these incidents that happen, unexplained mysteries that happen that always prevent the opening of the camp. But now Steve Christie is trying to, in all his shirtless glory with the red bandana around his neck, he is trying to open it up again for a whole new generation of campers to enjoy. Not Camp Blood, but of course Camp Crystal Lake. And then, but that is the mythology, right, as we understand it, which therefore sets up the notion that we understand at the very end, or close to the end, the twist is that the killer is Mrs. Voorhees. And we don't even see her. We don't even catch wind of her character until the moment that she arrives, more or less, in that wonderful beige, light blue sweater that is iconic now, of course. And this performance is great, too, because Mrs. Voorhees, it's one of those things where I think it's one of the great traits of iconic villains in movie history, is that they're very dangerous and they have a really dangerous physical presence, as well as this way of totally absorbing all of the energy, such that all the focus becomes on this character. Mrs. Voorhees is no exception to that. She is so overpowering and villainous. It's great. And it's one of those things too where she smiles, right? Every time she smiles, it's even scarier. So it's one of those things where if a character smiles and it's even scarier. That is a trait of a true villain right there. Fantastic stuff. And she's strong, and she's got this force of will, and she won't give up even when Alice beats her with the poker or does things. She won't give up. And there's a bit at the end when they're by the lake front there, and the sand, and Mrs. Voorhees is on top of Alice, and she's just trying to force Alice's face into the sand. And this is just a force of nature, this unbelievable force of nature that is Mrs. Voorhees. And the only thing, of course, to stop the force of nature is not another force of nature, no, but a machete, right? And a Tom Savini machete. And I love that's another iconic moment, right? It's a Tom Savini effect, and therein lies the way that the film offs its villain on the one hand, but therein also lies what ends up becoming the crux of what becomes Friday the 13th Part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., 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 right? Because it's from there, of course, that we get what ends up becoming the retrofitted application of the Jason myth that we see will play itself out in later films. But just a point about the great effect, right? I always love that thing, and it blah, and then that's a great moment, right? And so and then speaking of which, right, Tom Savini's effects are truly spectacular and ghastly. There are moments where it's just suddenly it just happens, and it's this huge shock. And it's not just the effect too, but it's the way that the camera is well paced enough to linger on it just enough, and then the editing is well placed so then it cuts away. So that's true, for instance, when we see the demise of characters like Annie in the woods with and then also especially with Jack, and character Jack, the Kevin Bacon character, which is one of the most famous death scenes in the Friday the 13th franchise, with him in the bed, and then he's after a bit of fun with Marcy. Marcy, and then so she is away, and then just leaving Jack alone in the bed, and he notices a little bit of something that falls, and we understand it's blood because the body of Ned is up there on the top bunk while the two of them were in the bottom bunk, and then suddenly, of course, we understand what happens. Boom, and so it lingers, and then you can actually see some more stuff of it. Depending on the version of the film that you see. But the point is that it still cuts away. And there are other moments too. Well, before I go to that, let me just say that we'll talk about a moment in Friday the 13th history. Jack and Marcy in that bunk bed with the body of Ned at the top, and what we understand, I think Mrs. Voorhees was under the bed the entire time they were doing it. And so that's a like I don't know how you put it. It's like almost like a Friday the 13th type of sandwich. If you will, you have Mrs. Voorhees on the bottom, you have the body of Ned at the top, and then in the middle you have two camp counselors, essentially, or I guess wannabe camp or in training, doing it. And so that's the ultimate Friday the 13th sandwich, if ever there was one. But what was I saying? So yes, so Tom Savini's effects also have a really great way of, on the one hand, showing us a lot, and perhaps really going for the jugular when it comes to the out-and-out spectacle of the blood and guts special effects. And the death scene of Jack is a great example of that. Also, Mrs. Voorhees is a great example of that. But there are other moments too. There are other moments too where we see the after effect, but not the actual, say, penetration of the instrument. So we see, for example, I think the Marcy and the axe to the head, which is a really gruesome effect. I mean, look at it, but we don't actually see it. We get the editing effect and the cut back and forth, and then the implication of what we see based on what we see after the effect. Incidentally, that axe head is as big as her head itself, which is amazing. But also we get the moments where we don't see what happens. And this is true, I think, for Brenda. We understand that she was in the rain in front of the archery range, or in the archery range, and then we hear the scream, and we see later her body, but we never see exactly what happened. We understand what happens to him. Also with Bill, we see the aftermath of what happened to him, but I don't think we ever see exactly what happened, how it occurred. Steve Christie also in a very interesting. We see a little bit of a flash in terms of the POV effect, but we never see the carry through, if you will. So this is an example of how sometimes the film decides to show. Oh, and also Ned as well. We don't see what happens. We see Ned walking into the cabin after he witnesses what he thinks is just some stranger walking in. And he walks in, and we never see him again except as a corpse in the top bunk of the bed. So we don't actually see how it happened, right? So my point is that sometimes the film shows us, but other times it just holds back and just gives us the aftermath of whatever the violence had ensued. And I think that's an interesting way of presenting the slasher film elements of this film. And it's not wholly inconsistent with what we might see in other films, because in other films too, we will see moments where the effect is actually shown in all of its gory glory on screen, but then there are moments too where characters are off screen, or in a way that we never see again, and we see that continue in part 2, part 3, part 4, and beyond. So, and therefore that kind of tradition, if you will, is, I think, well established already from the outset, which makes, I think, for a really interesting presentation of violence, and also the need for editing, and the need to make sure that everything is well paced, because I think also those scenes, they never linger on too much. And I think they cut away just in the nick of time, so then to create the shock, but then don't let us linger on too much to notice that it's an effect, if you know what I mean. And I think that editing trick and technique is really good, and it fits in well with the Tom Savini style. And I think Tom Savini too, when he describes his effects, he always describes it not as an effect alone, but it's an effect along with cutting away, as though trying to maintain what he always refers to as the illusion. And so I think that to create a magic trick, and I think in that way, the effect, the application of the actual practical effect, plus the camera work, plus the editing and the application of music, all come together to create this series of magic tricks, these illusions, a la Tom Savini. So this is it's Friday the 13th, and it's a film that is very iconic. It is one that I always find to be really good in terms of the camaraderie among the teenagers. Alice and Brenda and Bill and Jack and Marcy and Ned. I think they form a really good crew of people. I like the scene with, I like many of the scenes. I like the scene where they are, Ned is pretending to be drowning, and I think Brenda and Jack, they're the ones who really run down the dock really quickly, and they dive into the water to try to save him, I think, right? So I think it's Brenda dives in, and then Jack. I think Brenda in particular is a really good diver. I think I have that right. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And then there's also when Ralph is invading the campsite, and then we have the cop, I think his name is Dorf, come and trying to ask if they've seen Ralph, and Ned is really being a bit too rambunctious, and at one point Dorf says, "Can it, goat cheese?" I love that line. I love the thing that he calls him goat cheese. Wow, that's and then he says to Jack, the Kevin Bacon character, have you been smoking marijuana or something like that? But the goat cheese line is really interesting. One of the great lines in Friday the 13th, goat cheese. There's an interesting dynamic between Alice and Steve Christie. They had a relationship. I think that's the implication. But Steve Christie is he's a bit of a creeper when he's alone with Alice outside, and he's trying to make small talk about her drawings, and he becomes all of a sudden so ominous and like wanting to seduce her again or something like that. And she's like, I need some time. And we see that artist instinct emerge again, that she was, we see, of course, that she returns in part 2, and there's a little moment where we see a little glimpse of her artwork and that she needs time alone. So Alice seems like a character who needs time, although she's willing to give the camp and Steve apparently another chance, at least for another week. Because so next by Fridays, because today is Friday the 13th. And today is Jason's birthday, after all. But that's a nice, I think, well, I don't know if I would call it nice, but it's an interesting dynamic, Steve and Alice, although Steve then departs for most of the movie. So when we see him, he's either with shirt or without shirt. He's either without shirt, or he's got that yellow raincoat on. And so, whatever the case may be, it's a very memorable fashion sense from Steve Christie. And then we have Alice too, which is an interesting turn or a depiction of what might you call the final, what's returned as the final character to survive. And sometimes in these films, and slasher films, the final character to survive is oftentimes portrayed in terms of virginal innocence. But what I like about Alice's character is that she is depicted as being someone who, as I say, she may have been in a relationship with Steve. And she seems to be a little bit older. I'm not sure if she's maybe she's an older teenager or in her early 20s. I'm not sure exactly, but I think she's depicted as being somewhat older and a little bit more mature than, say, Ned or Jack or Marcy. Perhaps she's on the same level of maturity as, say, Brenda and Bill. So I like her character in that aspect, and also she I think she has this real life sense about her. Although she does sleep quite suddenly, right? When Bill is talking to her and saying, "I'm going to go," she's already sleeping, and so and I think she's sleeping even though she's talking, which is an interesting trick. But what was I? So that's Alice, and then I spoke about Brenda a little bit, and there's the strip Monopoly. She's got the strip Monopoly. She's the one who wants to play strip Monopoly, but then it's interesting if you notice, right? It starts raining, and she's playing with Bill and Alice, and there comes a point where she's actually quite undressed down to her undergarments. And it's interesting that at this moment she says, "Oh my goodness, would you look at the rain? I forgot to close the windows of my cabin, so we have to stop this game, and I have to go, and we'll play it again some other time." So that's a very interesting sense of timing on the part of Brenda. She seems, of course, very outgoing, very friendly, very affable, good-natured. And she's also, I think, a vegetarian, which is why she says, she says to Marcy, when Marcy says, "We have hamburger," and Brenda says, "Oh, no. Do you have apples? Do you know how to make apple pie?" And Marcy says, "Yes," which is really incredible, actually. Because I think I understand that apple pie is really difficult to make. So the fact that Marcy is able to say yes immediately, I think, shows a lot of skill on the part of Marcy, at least. But anyway, going back to Brenda, she is at just the point where she is at the most undressed of all three. She says, "Oh, would you look at that? I forgot to close the windows of my cabin, so I have to go, and I'll see you later." So that's interesting timing. So that might be a suggestion that maybe she is maybe a little bit shyer, more shy than she might otherwise have led on, which I think is very reasonable, because it's still, I mean, I don't know, I've never played strip Monopoly before in my life, but I can imagine if I were to play strip Monopoly, and if I were in the situation where I were in a certain level of undress, the same as Brenda, then I would be very nervous indeed, and I'd probably try to find any way that I could to get out of the situation. So, but anyway, so that's Brenda and strip Monopoly, but also Brenda as a character, and she's a really interesting one, and she's the one who responds to what she thinks is the call, a distress call of a young boy, but in fact it turns out to be something very, very different to her. To her tragedy, of course, and then we had Jack and Marcy and Ned, so that trio, and then the couple of Jack and Marcy, and so they are together, but they seem to be also very friendly towards the other people. So I like the fact that there's this sense of camaraderie with the group, as well as establishing the dynamic between the two of them. And then Annie, as I was mentioning earlier, the hitchhiker, who is also, though friendly and affable, and then just overly ambitious, I suppose, in terms of her dreams. And she gets a ride with the truck driver. I think his name is Enos, and he talks about Camp Blood and all that. And then she gets another ride, unfortunately, we understand, from Mrs. Voorhees, which is to her great tragedy, of course, because of what happens to the Annie character. And other aspects of the film too. The music is, of course, iconic. All right, and it's the, as I was mentioning, the effects too, and the jump scares I think are just as effective as they were when I first saw the film, and the way that the music is overlaid and the sudden wow when Jason the little boy comes out of the water and grabs Alice and draws her into the water out of her canoe, and the like, and so right, all this is just my way of saying that I was a big fan of Friday the 13th, the film, and I still am. And now with the advent of this new Blu-ray box set from Scream Factory, I am even happier as a fan of Friday the 13th. And so I'll try to continue on maybe with these off-the-cuff comments on the films going forward. But that is my general sense of Friday the 13th. So I'm glad it's here for people to see and enjoy. So anyway, thank you very much. Cheers.